Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kylie Bryant, and I'll be facilitating this panel today. I'm a partner at Deloitte, and I specialise in the financial services industry and have had a long career in financial services, so it's great to see some familiar faces in the room today. So just our synopsis on this topic. As technology improves productivity and the new financial advice regime is embedded into New Zealand, what are the lessons of delivering professional financial advice in 2024, and how can it drive trust and more access for Kiwis? So on our panel today, we have Angus Dale-Jones, Chair of Financial Advice Code Committee. We've got Carmen Vicelich from Valocity, and we have Jonathan from OMNIMAX, and we have Josh Frankland from Partners Life. So fantastic to have this stellar lineup today. So what we'll do is we'll kick into it. So I'll get the panel to introduce themselves. Angus, we will start with you and your perspective.
I'm Angus Dale-Jones. I'm chair of the Financial Advice Code Committee. So we are established by the Financial Markets Conduct Act to write the Code of Professional Conduct for advice. Kylie, do you want me to go into more details now?
Yeah.
So my perspective is, I suppose, really a regulatory perspective. So the new financial advice regime is 3.5 years old. And in fact, parts of it, because of transitional provisions, are only 1.5 years old. So it's a very new regime, and it's difficult to assess how that regime is going because we're so early in the piece. So to distinguish the new financial advice regime from the former regime, perhaps the biggest thing to focus on, and it's directly relevant to technology, is that in crafting the new legislation, Parliament and the advisors in MB sought to remove barriers wherever possible. So previously, the legislation had focused on advice being given by individuals. Previously, the earlier regime had distinguished between types of products. Previously, the regime had differentiated between personalised advice that is tailored for a particular client and general or class advice that was meant sort of more for a more broad audience. So all of those barriers were removed. Sitting in the middle of this new regime is a requirement in the legislation for a code of conduct. And the purpose of that code of conduct is to add to, if you like, the harder legislative requirements with more fluid requirements that are evolved over time in discussion with industry and consumers that work for the giving of advice. So the Code Committee, in structuring the code, tried to stay true to this philosophy of not creating barriers in the regime. And the number one barrier that was uppermost in our minds was to recognise that advice no longer is always given by an individual. Sometimes advice is given by technology alone. Often advice is given in a way that uses digital process. It might not be entirely a digital process, but it's a combination of a human being and a digital process. So the code tries to set out a regime that will work if you're dealing with technology, will work if you're dealing with a mix of humans and technology, and will work for humans. Ironically, we've been criticised in sort of taking this principles-based approach and not introducing barriers, that we're not specific enough, that we should be specific about what's required of AI or technology in a more general sense. And we have steered clear of that because we think as soon as we lock in compliance requirements specific to technology, somebody's going to develop either new technology or a new business model for using technology in a different way. So we push back strongly at the idea of the code being specific about technology. I think, Kylie, that's the sort of overview of the perspective that I come from.
Thank you. Carmen, we'll hand over to you next to introduce yourself and your perspective on this topic.
Thank Hi, everybody. I'm Carmen Vicelich, and I'm the founder of 3 technology and data companies. Data Insight empowers organizations with their own data, so uses AI to help companies make data-driven decisions. Valocity is a technology platform that empowers better decision-making around property. So in New Zealand, we work with 90% of lenders and many of the brokers, and across the world in India, UAE. And Generate Zero also embraces AI it's a carbon emissions platform to help companies measure, monitor, and reduce their carbon emissions and do their automated reporting. So across all of those, we do a lot of work with banks, we do a lot of work with data, and we do a lot of work with AI. And my perspective is the world is changing faster than ever before in terms of technology, in terms of AI, in terms of what's possible with data. And we really have this friction because on the one hand, all of us want seamless and relevant experiences. And we see this with open banking. We see this with the technology that we use where we share our information, whether it's on Uber sharing our location, whether it's on Apple or Amazon sharing what we're reading, and everybody's talking about the digital mortgage. And certainly from a brokers and a trust, everybody wants it to be fast, easy, make my lives easier. On the other hand, the adoption and acceleration of AI, of deep tech, of what is possible if you share information and if you make information available is also evolving faster than ever before, faster than regulators can keep up, faster than companies can manage best practice. And so I really think it's up to us to really, my view is it's a changing world and it's about education, awareness, transparency, and really always on embracing how do we actually make people's lives easier through the work that we do, whether it's as trusted advisors and sharing information when it matters most for that financial decision, but also how do we embrace technology and AI or we'll get left behind, and at the same time having full eyes open to keep learning around managing the risks that introduces.
Thank you. Jonathan?
I'm Jonathan Taylor from OMNIMAX Software. So I come from a technology perspective, and we work with financial institutions to automate the advice process. And so we work from a range of different size companies, right from large organizations to 1 or 2 advisor companies, and just help them to streamline that advice process. So really my perspective on this, in terms of if we're going to get advice accessible to many Kiwis as possible, then we have to automate. And we also have to embrace robo-advice as well to automate that advisor thought process. And so that's a conversation we're having with a lot of our clients at the moment is a lot of them, they know how to give advice, but they haven't necessarily thought about how can that be sort of formed into an algorithm, how can that be automated so the advice can be offered via an online means.
Hi. So I'm from Partners Life, and as you'll know, a life and health insurer. We've got a perspective both from the technology point of view, that's my role, I'm the GM of IT Shared Services at Partners Life, and we operate an internal advice team as well as a long-time supporter of the IFA market. We provide digital tools to IFAs as well as using them internally. So we've been on the journey around providing digitally assisted advice for a long time now. My perspective, my background primarily in data analytics and technology is trying to think about how we can take this set of technology further into the future to address some of the challenges we've got around that element of trust. We've got new tools, we're still trying to understand how they work. Can we trust them yet? Can we be trusted to deploy them in a way that builds trust with end consumers, or will we make mistakes and potentially retrench from where people are currently, I think, quite excited to try some of these tools. That's my sentiment. The last angle, I think, is that we look ahead at the demographics of people that were going to be our customers of the future and what they're expecting from us. So I think they're expecting digital, they're expecting fast, they're expecting simple, and we need to try and figure out how to rise to the challenge.
Thank you. Josh, I might leave it with you as we kick into this. So obviously we've had a new code, and how has this impacted the provision of advice at Partners Life, and what have you been doing differently?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we are continuing to, provide advice much in the way that you might have expected in years past, but looking for ways to facilitate that journey using digital tools. So for us, it's not about replacing some of those key checks and good practice. It's about assisting them with digital, simple, visual guides that can help through that journey, explaining to the customer and supporting the advisor and trying to, come up with a needs analysis, come up with that statement of advice, show to the customer in an engaging way where their shortfall might be, and help them really get the message across. So at the end of the day, the numbers are providing that level of validation that this is good advice. It's the work that we're doing to use digital tools in that space is to accelerate, assist, and to provide a hybrid digital journey for the customers.
And just building on that, so you're really augmenting the advisor process. You've won innovation awards for the tool events. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Slight correction. We've come very close to winning awards for the digital tool events. So if you're not familiar with events, it is a fact finder needs analysis advice tool. As I kind of mentioned just before, the key thing it really does is gather the information required to go through that process and present it visually in a way that is really hard to ignore, showing that shortfall around, that customer's gap between what would happen if they were to, lose their partner or become disabled and be unable to work. So the way that tool represents that information really supports that advice journey, but underneath it all is some hard numbers to show that this is calculated in a way that is very, very difficult to argue with.
Okay, thank you. So this really is playing into that person-to-person advice market. But Jonathan, what I might do is hand over to you. So I'm really excited about the democratisation of advice through providing scalable digital advice. Can you just talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing with your clients and who you're working with, noting that we have a large KiwiSaver population and not many are getting advice today?
Yeah, so with the new regime coming in, it's opened up a whole bunch of new opportunities. So prior to that, some of our larger clients, their frontline staff, they couldn't give personalised advice. And so with the new code, they can now do that with the assistance of technology. And so the quality of conversations that are actually happening via frontline staff and larger institutions are really good, really nuanced as well. Looking at using Monte Carlo and probability algorithms about can they actually achieve their goals and guiding the conversation. So we're seeing a much higher level of quality of advice really being given by a frontline. So that's just one avenue. The other avenue as well is we work, as I mentioned before, with smaller advisor organisations as well. And so we've seen probably one of our strongest products is our KiwiSaver product, which automates the advice process right from start to finish. And the other opportunity which has come about, there's automation, but then there's actually robotising that process as well. So that can be delivered directly online with no delay. Gen Y, we're in a Gen Y, not we, I'm not quite Gen Y. It's a digital first generation. The expectation really is for instant results in this area as well. And so one of the most exciting things I enjoy doing is working with clients about how do you actually create the algorithms around the advice process. How can we take what the advisor has formally done in their head and actually digitize that? And so what we're doing is working with clients and offering these services directly via the websites as well. And so, one advisor, one organisation with digitalisation can reach so many more people. So that's really exciting. So we'd love to see advice getting deeper out there into the market. So there's still a long way to go, but with the regime changes, there are definitely, it opens up this opportunity for advisors to rethink their business model as well and how can they actually increase their reach in the marketplace.
Brilliant. No, I'm excited about the reach and getting advice out into the hands of more people. Carmen, I will hand to you now, and we're just talking about trust and advice go hand in hand. You obviously work locally and globally. So what trends are you seeing in building trust through technology globally that you think will come back to New Zealand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's evolving really quickly. Where previous speakers have spoken about technology and data and automation and robo-advisors. And I guess all of those things require data. And if you don't have accurate data or the right data or the right to use that data, then none of this innovation is possible. And we're really seeing this amazingly in some of the other markets that we're in. In India, the regulatory framework is tighter than anywhere in the world. Yet the empowerment for financial inclusion and financial enablement is phenomenal through the technologies and the trust that they've built. So 1.4 billion people, all have an Aadhaar identity. And that enables you, with your personal identity, to go and get access to everything just by sharing that information. And the way they got adoption is you couldn't get your pension, your phone SIM card, your bank account. You couldn't do anything without this identity. And now it's enabled phenomenal affordability, credit, access to credit, access to banking, access to financial inclusion and financial advice through the government actually bringing through that regulation. So I think that's really, and it's been incredible from fintech as well, empowerment. And in India, even people that are homeless have a mobile phone. So the adoption of technology, connectivity, and they call it India Stack, these digital rails to actually connect the ecosystem in a secure way that's so secure that actually government enables it. In markets like UAE, every time I land in UAE, and Valocity just launched there, every time I land, it's a more seamless experience because of this whole transparency of opting in and sharing your information to have a more seamless experience. So I was checking in my bag and they said, well, do you mind if you tick this box on the screen? We're going to keep your face and now you can just walk into the lounge. The doors just automatically open. You don't even have to scan your boarding pass. Well, it wasn't a chore to scan my boarding pass, but they're constantly thinking about seamless and relevant experiences through data. So I think we have a lot to learn globally in terms of what we're seeing there. But in New Zealand, conversely, we have a lot of good data. We know the starting point of the data that's accessible for advisors, for banking, is we have the owner's name at every single property. What did they pay for it? Who's the mortgage encumbrance? What's the address? That really rich data that if you're opted in and you've got your clients saying, I'm happy to share this with my advisor because they're giving me shared value exchange, that becomes really powerful in terms of what innovation and what technology is possible. And in other markets, we don't see this. So in India, if you've never been to India, there's no address. So how do you then embrace AI and innovation and automated valuation models and all of these things if you don't even have a physical address? And so we've had to create different tools there. So conversely, on the one hand, you have everybody with a unique identifier and we know who you are. On the other hand, we have no idea where you are because there is no addressing. So there's this is absolute opposites. And we created an app for valuers when they go to the property to geotag the address, fill it out in the app, timestamp it, and all that information seamlessly, digitally to come back to the bank. And for banks doing 20 to 30,000 valuations a month, you can imagine that's a really quick game changer. But it's thinking about the problem you're solving and the technology and the data and the trust and security around that to create value. And I think that's the key point that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think that value exchange absolutely has to be right, and I think there's a lot we can learn globally, and I think we're looking to India to learn quite a lot about open banking at the moment as they lead the way in that space as well. Just building on that and your experience, Carmen, research has found that financial services is one of the top 5 industries prone to rapid disruption by AI. What impact do you see AI having on advice and trust in the market?
I think there's, lots of things that AI can obviously do. I think the starting point and the impact that we're seeing is around the regulatory compliance. So, the customer doesn't care if that's automated or person is doing that. And obviously, for best practice, there is a really strong compliance. Sitting next to the compliance guy, embracing compliance. But we are seeing this. So, Data Insight, sitting in the front here, is doing work with AI, in this space to actually say, well, you have to report that you've shared this information. So you're recording the conversation and they can automate those conversations in a bespoke way to say, well, 97% of these were compliant. this 3% of people need some training to make sure that they shared this information. And there's no ifs, maybes, or buts. The AI that we've created for those customers is automating that process. And, that's a really amazing shared value exchange that people don't mind being recorded because of that value. On the other hand, when you talk about trust and you talk about AI, it's very hard for those things to be hand in hand. When you talk about financial trust and the younger generation, they do have this expectations for digital and seamless, but there was an interesting experiment done in the UK where a bank said, well, for our young generation, you're going to walk into the bank and you're going to divide out. On this side, we're going to make the bank all white, like an Apple store. Everything's on this beautiful Macs, and come in here for your modern, and all the young generation can come in and swipe and do digital. And on the right-hand side, when they come into this bank brand, you can actually go to the suite where it's all green and luscious and wooden and old, and, we're going to talk about your financials here, and this is where the older people are going to go. And when they did the experiment, it was the opposite. The younger people all went into where, so this is serious. I don't have a lot of money. I can't get this wrong. I need a person to tell me how to do this. I'm going over here. I want to sit down and interact with a person. And the older generation were like, I know what I'm doing. I'm time poor. I'm over here. I'm digital. So it's the opposite. And I think that's what we really need to recognise, that actually when it comes to money and financial well-being, it's really that balance. Make my life easy. Automate where you need to automate, but also recognise that we still need a human at moments, and nothing against robo-advisors, but maybe the older generation that wants it fast and seamless and not embrace that, but it's still a journey, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a journey, and I think the research still says at those key moments of truth, with a lot of money involved, people want to speak to people. Angus, just with the code and AI, have you got any perspectives on that?
Well, I think central to the code is this concept of trust. Is that what? Yes,
Yep.
is working. So if you like, the standards in the code are the outputs, but the outcome that you're really after is trust and advice. But as this conversation has progressed today, I've been reflecting on, really what does trust mean? And trust is a much bigger concept than just the accumulation of people and technology driving advice. And I think the threshold issue for trust in the context of advice is getting over this barrier that many people have, that advice, or at least advice in certain circumstances, is not for them. Trust is, at the very start, about normalising getting advice. And now Fidelity Life, Bronwyn Kerman's in the room, have done an excellent piece of research into advice. And one of the limbs of that is talking about the normalisation of advice. So that, it's not so much about trusting the technology or trusting the person, but it's actually trusting the concept of advice is for you. So that's the first thing that I'd say for, how the code is trying to drive trust. We've got to make sure the code is producing advice behaviours where you normalise it. And it's not just normalise in the sense of how we've always done advice. Josh, when you were speaking, you talked about statement of advice. Now, statement of advice is not a regulatory requirement in New Zealand, and yet people insist on going back to statements of advice. Now, there's nothing wrong with digitising statements of advice if that's the best way of doing it. But I challenge people to think really hard about whether they need to do a needs analysis or whether they need to generate statements of advice in some advice situations that might not need that. So that sort of shows how you need to be flexible to the audience. I'm interested, Carmen, in hearing about you talking about research, because I'm sure there was research done about different demographics and how they trust advisors or advice given. And Lloyd, I think it was Minter Ellison Rudd-Watt's bit of research that they did where some of your younger staff members actually found that young consumers much preferred or trusted the technology more than seeing a human being. Am I right about that?
Yeah, we did a focus group. The line that sticks in my mind was a young woman called Dina Shu, who said, listen, Roy, when I know I'm going to meet my husband probably on a dating app, there's no way I'm going to sit across the desk from some old dude like you to know what to do with my money.
Yeah. Yeah.
She is now married and a partner in a firm in the UK. So,
Yeah. Yeah, so it's just illustrative, and I don't think there's really a right or a wrong answer, but you have to be so aware of creating trust that's relevant to the demographic you're thinking about. When we look at the code, one of our big concerns is it's not reaching specific consumer groups. Is it reaching Maori? Is it reaching some of the immigrant consumer groups in New Zealand in the way it could? So, you know, thinking about trust is not just this sort of singular concept. You need to conceive of it in a number of different ways. Sorry, I probably talked enough.
No, that's fine. Just conscious that our Q&A piece is missing at the moment. So I'm just going to pause to see if anyone's got any burning questions that they'd like the panel to answer while we're in flow.
can I make a comment?
Yes.
Another thing coming out of that focus group was there was a young guy, he must have been about 26, who he and his sister had inherited their family's estate. So all of a sudden they were worth over $1 million. They couldn't find a financial advisor who would talk to them because they looked super young. And so one of the issues is whether personal human advice is actually accessible to people if they don't fit our assumption of what a client looks like. But tech mostly doesn't care. People, if you ask.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy. And if you ever go buy a car with your husband, everyone keeps talking to the husband. Yes. And the car's for me. You know, there is this unconscious bias that because you're the wife, I dropped my car off at the valet and she goes, oh, you've got a rich husband. And I'm like, no, I work really hard. She actually said that to me on Saturday night. I think you're right, and there is, you know, different demographics. Obviously, I have 4 children, and you know, the other day we were saying, well, is so and so nearby? And they're like, oh yeah, they're about 5 minutes, and I'm like, how do you know? They're not on our live 360, and they're like, oh, you know, the Snapchat, and I'm like, oh wow, am I sharing where I am on Snapchat? Because I didn't mean to share. But you set me up on Snapchat, and there is this inherent trust in this sharing of information, and that's where I think it goes back to what I said earlier around education. And trust is also really important with education, because for many of us, we share information and we don't intend it to be used for that purpose. And when you think about all of that information coming together and what's possible with AI, we will be living in the era of just because you could doesn't mean you should, because there's so much. And we know it was many years ago we did analytics and found out that on a Friday night, if you're buying a 6-pack of beer and condoms and cigarettes, you're more likely to default than if on a Friday night you're buying nappies, broccoli and Chardonnay. And, you know, because you know that information, should that impact your credit score? Not necessarily. And, you know, should that information be able to be shared if you're some group that actually has the data all flowing? Where do we say, actually, to give you the best advice? Because I think we're in this real flux of change. You know, one of my vehicle can actually record all of my driving. Do I want to share that with my insurer for when I speed to Omaha? But actually they might go, well, I want to know that. I'm not saying I'm speeding for the media in the room. Phil, don't record that. But now I'm speeding and dropping my car off at valets and picking on guys with condoms and beers. But, you know, it really, the actually analogy is how many of you, you know, would want everyone to know what you eat every day and, you know, your alcohol frequency and all of that information. So yet there are apps that say, well, put this information in and I'll help you be healthy. I'll tell you your fat score. I'll tell you your demographic age. I'll tell you all these things. And we want all these things to help us. And so I think we're really living in an amazing shifting time when I say that, you know, change is happening faster than ever before, because we're all, oh, yeah, I'll share that information and tell me this. But where's that information going? And as advisors, trust is so important, because what will you do with my information and what will you not do with my information? That's really important. And are you protecting that as an asset, as, you know, the care that it needs to be given? Because we all read the headlines of companies with cyber and ransomware and those things, and we all think it won't happen to us. Why? They're not going to pick on you because you're a smaller firm, because you're in a different location. You're in Hamilton, so you're okay. Everybody is open to those risks. So trust is also about governance and security and transparency, and I think those things are really important.
Yeah, I guess as we've journeyed with the advice process, we've just really been scrutinising the need. Do we need to collect this piece of information? And we probably do advice on the least information possible now. And if we don't need to collect it, don't collect it. So I think that's really paramount to trust, is actually what are you going to use this information for? So that's really key in that area as well.
I'll just add that a couple of interesting things around how people, especially the generations coming up, are choosing to access advice. And I was looking at the Global Consumer Survey, the Remark survey, looking specifically at data around life and health. And what was interesting is that and it was specifically around Gen Z and millennials, for those of you who are not aware, and their behaviours. And what was interesting was that for those two groups, the first place that they were going to go most of the time when they were triggering to purchase, if it wasn't a mandatory purchase because they were required by their bank, was on recommendation from friends and family, and then coming in a close second was from advisors. And on that advice thing, the question was, where will you go to seek your advice? And number one for life and health was, an advisor again. So what's interesting is there's this conversation around digital, where are we going to go? But time and again, the people element keeps coming back, especially around the life and health insurance place, where it's a grudge purchase, right? Everybody realizes at some point that they need to have it, but no one's really that excited about buying it. And an interesting experience from within Partners Life is that in our internal distribution team, I was talking to one of the team back at the office, they said that one of the biggest differences between someone getting all the way into the process and ultimately getting through the advice process is seeing someone. Doesn't have to be in person. The difference between getting on a video call and seeing another human being versus dealing with a detached voice or a completely digital service. So those are just interesting aspects of this. We're trying to push the technology, bring AI into the mix, but the trends we're seeing is that there is a portion of people that want that, but still probably the majority that don't. They want a human interaction in there.
Josh, we were talking earlier about the finfluencers. Was that with me and you, or was it Jonathan? Yeah. We were talking earlier about the finfluencers, the financial influencers who are on TikTok, and that's where the younger generation are going. Can you just expand on that a little bit, the conversation we had earlier?
Yeah, so that term finfluencers has been around for a while now, and I guess it is sort of social media influencers on TikTok or any platform who are giving a general advice. It should be general advice anyway, but it can be, when you're on TikTok, you're exposed to the whole world, basically. And so I think the research I saw was from the States, and when asked, let me just check it in here, I think it was 37% of Gen Z investors and up to 50% of Chinese Gen Z investors were influenced by influencers in choosing their investment results. So I think that we can't underestimate how much the younger generation are being influenced by the likes of TikTok and platforms like that. So that really, changes the face of the advice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have got the technology working for the questions, so we have some questions coming through now, so thank you very much, everyone, and please keep them coming. Angus, this is one for you. The code committee has kept the code principles based rather than specific. Most advisors get the reasons, but would also prefer examples of what good looks like. Is there a willingness by the code committee to provide these examples?
So the way the code is structured is we have standards, and for each standard we have a commentary. So we go through quite detailed discussions about how much we can do in commentary to help understand the standard. So our minds are set, at least they're currently set, on keeping the standards themselves as principles-based standards, but the commentary we're open to seeing if we can provide some more help. We've just concluded a consultation round, not so much on the conduct of advisors, but the competence, knowledge and skill that people giving advice need to have. and we're exploring there how we might demonstrate what good looks like in a little bit more detail than perhaps we might previously have done. So we don't have a final decision there, but we do hear quite clearly that sometimes if you're too principles-based, you can end up with a document that, really gets quite cryptic. When you talked about sitting next to the compliance guy, I always bristle at being talked about as a compliance guy. But, I think trying to separate out compliance on the one hand from, yes, and a regulatory outcome. So in the wording of the code, what we don't want to do is put in guidance material that gets in, or commentary material that gets interpreted as this is the only way you can do it. So we're also cautious of that.
Yeah. And while you've still got the microphone, what's coming next with the code?
Okay. So our number one driving mandate is to let the regime bed in. The only reason that we've recently done consultation on competence, knowledge and skill is there's such a long lead time in people getting qualified to come into the profession, and we just wanted to make sure that there was no ambiguity there. So we do not want to rush anything, and people have had to deal with a lot of regulatory change, and I think it's really important to allow the regime to settle in, to see how technology starts to evolve in the regime, within the new regime. However, there are a couple of areas that we are interested in. We think the code has been well refined through conversation and consultation with industry, but we're not sure that we are reaching all groups of consumers that we could be reaching. So I think we're understanding the signal senders, but we're not really understanding the receivers of advice as best we can. So over the next couple of years, we do want to do more work, and whether we do this work just as a code committee or whether this becomes a bigger government-type project, perhaps something that we do together with the FMA, for example, to try and understand what might be good for consumers, what consumers might want, what consumers, through a bit of discussion, might help us evolve in terms of what they might want. So very much a consumer-focused exploration, I think, would be worthwhile. That ideally would need to be backed up with data, so data about how people think and behave in different circumstances. And as you can imagine, envisage, getting that sort of data is really, really difficult to get your hands on or even create. So that's one thing. What was my second point? I had a very exciting second point, which oh yes, my second point was this. The way the regulation works and the way compliance people think is advice is an event. You give a piece of advice and that's what's regulated. But with advice, particularly when you get to that more inclusive, the advisor's doing everything for you, advice is less about the event and more about the relationship. So I'm not saying that the regime needs to be reworked and move away from just regulating individual events, but I do think over the next 2 to 5 years, we do need to think about, are we properly capturing what a consumer should reasonably be able to expect from an advice relationship, even if advice is not being given. And where this becomes really interesting for technology is what technology does with advice is it cuts across this trade-off that we've traditionally had between richness and reach. So if you want to reach a large population, before technology, you couldn't afford to have a rich service. So, generalized advice, class advice tended to be very narrow because that's all you could do. But technology allows you to merge richness and reach. You can reach a lot. I get the phrase from a book, and I haven't been able to track down that because it was a subtitle of a book. I haven't been able to track down that book. But this idea of thinking about richness and reach is really interesting. So as you use technology to reach not just lots of people, but reach them in a, I can see, Carmen, you want to add to this, in a way that is a rich offering that really changes the dynamics of how advice could be given.
Yep, no, thank you.
I really love that, because actually, if you are thinking about advisors and advice and having a relevant conversation with their customers, this is where technology is a game changer in data. So a lot of the work we do is always on and next best conversation. So, you know, no matter how big your portfolio is or how many customers you're looking after, no matter how good you are, how can you remember all of those things, the big things and the small things, and also actually, you know, understand when best to reach out and when you should and when you shouldn't. And this is where technology is a game changer. And you know, we do a lot of work on that. So actually, this is your anniversary. You've had your mortgage for so long. Congratulations. And just reaching out, hope it's going well. Then you know it's coming off floating. Or even to the opposite. You know, obviously, Valocity tracks the value of a property over time for banks. But imagine the advisors getting that data and actually being able to see this customer's now got this much equity. Do you want to look at your next investment property? This is where you can invest for capital gains, capital yield. You're really adding value versus somebody's house value may have dropped below what they paid for it, and they're having some issues. So actually, it's a help conversation and it's a different conversation. But you know, all of that data is there right now, and the automation of the nice things of an automatic happy birthday, you know, I hope you're having a great day, you know, and value add, that's not hard because you have that data in your system. It's about using technology to automate those messages, or they've had a baby and now they're turning, you know, X age, and now you want to say, well, should you have a savings account? You can really look at the lifetime end to end and really leverage technology. And this is where there's some sectors that do this incredibly well. That's how they nurture, engage, to have the next best conversation, next best offer, leveraging technology and data at pace and at scale. And I think that's really exciting.
Carmen, there's a question for you. The risk with AI, it can't pick up the emotions or nuances of a person-to-person conversation like an advisor can. How do you deal with this risk?
It's actually, well, why are you measuring emotions and what are you wanting to measure and monitor? And in that example, it was really compliance to make sure the advisor was advising particular information that they were regulatory required to do, and how do you record that en masse? And, you know, without being with that person, how do you know that they did that? And the team sitting in the front row that did some of that work, so, you know, they'll know the nuances of, it was really, really interesting project. But I think that's the, you know, emotion, you can't measure emotion with AI, you're right. But it's actually saying, what are you wanting to measure and what's the outcome that you want? It's not AI for AI's sake. Obviously, I'm slightly biased. I have AI in all three of my companies. I love AI. But, you know, we also get, oh, we want to use AI. Well, that's just, sometimes it's not necessarily the right tool. So what are you trying to do? If you're trying to automate and use data and automate a process, AI is amazing. But, yeah, no, it doesn't capture emotion.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question here. An hour ago, the FMA noted another advice firm whose FAP has been suspended for various failures. What responsibility and role do you see these emerging platforms in supporting hybrid advice and also ensuring on behalf of the client they can trust the advice? Maybe Josh, you might be able to answer that.
Yeah, I'm going to talk from my perspective, which is primarily around technology rather than the advice space. But I spend a lot of time thinking about exactly the challenge of how do you design a system to meet that requirement to say, you know, it's good enough. What threshold do you need to meet before you can deploy that? And I think that's a challenge that keeps evolving. In the previous class of technologies, you were using rules engines, and you can examine every part of every decision and track it back and say, yeah, I understand how it got there. The generation of technology that kind of came after that was around your machine learning, your predictive algorithms. And there's enough, I think, understanding about how you can qualify that it's making a good decision enough of the time that you're comfortable that it's appropriate to use. I think the challenge that comes with the latest class of technologies is that it's primarily an enormous model that can do so many things. I'm talking about the LLMs, your ChatGPTs, your, you know, llamas. And they were trained by someone else on a huge data set that you can't control. So you're taking something enormous and then trying to tweak it to do something very specific for your business. And I think it presents a real challenge. And we were talking before about, how does the code play into that? And I think that it's been designed in a way that anticipates the changing technology, from my point of view anyway, that says that, if you're too prescriptive, you're going to get leapfrogged. The technology is going to go straight past you. I think focusing on the outcome makes sense, because then if you can prove that you're getting the right outcome, you can adapt as the technology changes.
Brilliant. Did we have any more questions from the audience?
So regulation, I think, drives some people away from the regulated advice industry. And we have there's a significant amount of people who go to the unregulated industry. And I'm thinking crypto, right? So a lot of people, they say 80% in some surveys, have been defrauded of money through the crypto industry. So I'm wondering if you guys had a comment on how to tackle the problem of people avoiding the regulated industry and going for this easy, low barrier entry from the crypto world or other type things. How can we tackle that sort of gap?
So, now I'm putting on my old regulator's hat when I was a real regulator rather than just writing.
Regulator, that word, he said it more times than I did.
And the perimeter is always a challenge. And the rule setters, Parliament, usually decides what gets regulated and what doesn't get regulated. So it's essentially a risk decision where you set that boundary line. Once you're within that boundary, the regulator, so the Financial Markets Authority, has a role in patrolling the perimeter and making sure that if people are falling foul of existing rules, that they get caught. But assuming a person isn't caught, that's that sort of high-level parliamentary risk-based decision to say, well, we're not going to look after people there. They're not swimming between the flags. They do their own thing. But if they are caught within the flags and they are, conducting a regulatory activity, then you need to be purposive in deciding how you regulate. And in the sense of the code, we get our purposes from the legislation, and particularly there's a trade-off that is described in the code between the quality of advice and the availability of advice. So, whatever mechanism you're using, whatever you're doing, if you're caught in that regulatory field, we have to invent rules, but those rules have to be balanced so that they don't stop the reasonable availability of advice, but they preserve adequate quality of advice. And there is no perfect answer. It's a balancing technique. It's how do you get the mix right? And ultimately, if there's a big failure and people say, we don't think this should have happened, then the regulatory playing field gets adjusted, but we operate within how it's established and set up.
I think it's also that it's about education to the public, and this is, even in our schools, what are they teaching our children, from bottom up to also, older generations downwards, because the regulation, as great as it is, can't keep up with the technology and what is possible, and also can't keep up with people that if someone has a nefarious agenda, no regulation is going to stop them from doing that. The Facebook with the pre-election and the Cambridge Analytics, they didn't do that and anticipate that someone was going to use it in that way. So, even if they had regulation to say, well, you can't or you shouldn't, you can't actually think of all these things. And, I remember in the early days of Facebook, and then they had Foursquare, and somebody pulled from Facebook, single blonde female, and somebody pulled from Foursquare, this is where people are, and they created an app that said, meet single blonde females out tonight. Which nightclubs are they at? Is that okay? Well, I have 4 children and 3 of them are daughters. I don't think so. Was the regulation going to stop that? No. You shared your information here. You shared your information here. No one said I couldn't link it, so I did. And that actually happened. And I think that's where the world that we're living in, that awareness of what information are you sharing and why, and what are you enabling, we have to become more and more aware of that. So someone actually took my identity on social media, on Insta, put a different name, and I was standing up talking in a fintech conference, and they said they were a blockchain crypto trader, and they had all of my photos as a fintech entrepreneur selling crypto and blockchain. And I only found out when someone said, "Oh, you ripped me off on my crypto." I'm like, "What? Who are you? What are you talking about?" So, no regulation. I couldn't get them to take down my images that they said were them, even though there is regulation around that. So I think there's certainly, obviously, a role to play, but also we can't expect the regulatory boundaries to stop those that are going to be wanting to do these things, and that's the world that we live in.
Cool, thank you. We might just close with some closing comments. Josh, your closing comments?
Yeah, it's been quite an interesting discussion. I think that theme around, the way the world's evolved and the amount of data that we're constantly consuming and providing to everybody is only seems to be accelerating, and there is a kind of constant challenge to try and keep up. I guess if you're talking about from an education point of view, from a regulatory point of view, I guess from a provider point of view, right, there's opportunities there, but also potentially a lot of dead ends and wrong turns. I think that in this trust access space, the thing that I think it's that comment around reach is really one that resonates, because I think when we think about what we're doing at Partners Life, that's exactly what our tools are designed to do. They're designed to make that process simpler so that we can provide that advice journey to more people with more certainty, which brings the effort down, which increases the access, right? And so, yeah, I think in summary, the direction of travel is really interesting. It's exciting. I can see a lot of different and complicated things on the horizon that we're going to need to deal with, but I'll be very interested to see how it turns out.
Yeah, I agree, Josh. It's a very exciting time in terms of technology. I don't think we've ever had such a range of tools to use, and also the code does allow a huge scope in which to use them. So I think we're only limited by our imaginations. And you're right, Josh, we're probably going to head down some dead ends in how we do this, and it is very much a learning process, and that's what we're finding with our clients is we are very much learning on how to do this. You're not giving us a guidebook saying this is how it should look. Paramount to this is making sure that process does create trust in the consumer as well. So it is an exciting time. So I'm looking forward to see how it evolves.
Thank you. Yeah, I concur that. As an entrepreneur in tech and data, I always say it's never been more exciting, but it really hasn't. I think there's three key things that I think are top of mind. Agile technology. No matter what technology you're using today, you have to keep your eyes wide open. It's going to continue to evolve. You need to embrace, experiment, and make sure that what you're doing is future-proof. So agile technology, trusted data. That is the asset of the future. So what data are you capturing? Is it protected? Is it trusted? And can you rely on it? And the trust and data and transparency around that becomes more important than ever. And probably the third is human-centered design. Technology and data should make our lives easier. And actually, in everything that you do, especially in advisors, they're thinking about human-centered design. What is the human experience? What is the user journey? And how does that make our lives easier and better? And so people will adopt it, and you can continue to involve with more data and with more technology.
Thank you. I never relinquished the microphone, sorry.
The whole time.
So trust is essentially a human trait. And technology, even really, really sophisticated technology, is still a tool that we use to express ourselves as humans. So I think it is important that we have a code in the advice space that is flexible to different human thinking about all sorts of concepts, but including trust. We need it not to be hardwired into just one way of thinking. It needs to be flexible so that we, through whatever tools we use, can express human trust as we as a community think it should be expressed.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think we've had a fantastic conversation, and there's been some great questions from the audience and contribution, and we'll put our hands together for our panel today. Thank you very much.
Bye.